I had just wrapped up my meeting at the Pentagon when I received an urgent call. A situation had popped up, nothing too out of the ordinary, but serious enough to need my attention. As I stepped into the car, I never expected the day to take such an unexpected turn. Traffic was light as I sped down the highway, the warm afternoon sun beaming down. But as I turned onto a quieter road leading to the outskirts of the city, a police car pulled in behind me, lights flashing. I pulled over instinctively, but a knot formed in my stomach. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was in a military uniform, plain and professional, nothing unusual. The officer stepped out and approached my vehicle. He looked me over, his eyes lingering a moment too long. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?" I shook my head, not sure where this was going. "No, officer. I haven't noticed anything unusual." He nodded slowly. "You were speeding back there. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." I was taken aback. Speeding? I wasn't even close to going over the limit. But the look in his eyes made it clear he wasn't interested in a simple ticket. Something else was at play. I complied and stepped out of the car. As soon as my feet hit the ground, he started questioning me sharply. His tone was dismissive. I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right, but I kept my composure. He didn't know who I was, yet. "Name and ID," he barked. I gave him my name and rank, keeping my voice calm. When he saw it on my military ID, his demeanor changed, just for a second. But then, it was back to the same icy stare. "You're a U.S. Army general, huh?" He muttered, almost like he wasn't sure if he should be more surprised or angry. "Yes, that's correct," I replied, but his attitude didn't change. He kept me standing there, asking irrelevant questions as if he was looking for a reason to do more than just issue a ticket. My patience was wearing thin, but I didn't want to escalate anything. Not yet. What I didn't know was that his next move would set the stage for something much bigger. The officer's interrogation went on for what felt like an eternity. He seemed determined to trip me up with questions about my car's registration, my personal details, and even my family. It was beyond frustrating, but I kept my cool. As he continued to speak to me in that condescending tone, something felt wrong. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain, like he was testing me, trying to provoke me into a reaction. Finally, after what seemed like an endless back and forth, he asked me to step aside. His partner, who had been sitting in the car the entire time, emerged. He was younger, nervous, clearly not comfortable with the situation either. The older officer, the one who had been more hostile, turned to his partner and whispered something I couldn't quite make out. Whatever it was, it made the younger officer hesitate for a moment before reluctantly nodding and stepping back. Then, without any further explanation, the older officer stepped toward me, his hand moving to his belt. "Listen, I need you to come with me. You're being detained for questioning," he said abruptly. I froze for a moment, my military instincts kicking in. "Detained? For what? Under what charges?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked me up and down one more time, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we have a possible military officer in the area. Requesting backup." I felt my blood run cold. This was no longer about speeding. Something bigger was at play here, and I wasn't sure what game he was playing, but I wasn't about to let it continue. At that moment, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let him humiliate me or hold me hostage in this small corner of the city. Not without a fight. But I also needed to keep things calm. I glanced toward the road, seeing the distant lights of the city starting to blur. This was no longer about a simple traffic stop. There was something deeper going on. And I needed to figure out what it was before it spiraled out of control. The officer's grip tightened on his radio, but something in his posture shifted. It was almost like he realized he'd pushed too far. The younger officer stood awkwardly to the side, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could feel the tension mounting, but I refused to let panic take hold. I was trained to remain calm under pressure. "Officer," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you need to explain why I'm being detained. This isn't just a ticket, this is an accusation. I have rights, and you're not telling me what they are." The officer stiffened, his jaw tightening. But before he could respond, I saw movement in the distance, a black SUV pulling up behind the police cars. 2 more officers stepped out, this time wearing plain clothes. They moved with purpose, heading straight toward us. I could see the difference immediately. These were not your typical cops. They weren't here for a routine stop. The older officer's face went pale as they approached, and his hand moved away from his radio. The tension shifted instantly, the air now thick with uncertainty. The 2 newcomers didn't waste any time. One of them flashed a badge, his tone authoritative but calm. "Everything's under control here, officer. You can stand down." The officer who had been interrogating me didn't seem pleased but reluctantly took a step back. His partner followed his lead, and the younger officer simply stood there, unsure of what to do next. I kept my eyes on the new arrivals. They weren't the average law enforcement officers. Their demeanor suggested something more. Something serious. "We've got it from here," the second officer said, his eyes briefly scanning the older officer before locking onto mine. "General, we need to speak with you." The first officer hesitated for a moment longer, then grunted and returned to his vehicle, his face clouded with confusion and frustration. I turned to the officers now in charge. They didn't give me a chance to speak. One of them motioned for me to follow, and the other officer stayed behind, keeping a careful eye on the situation. As I walked toward the SUV, I couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. But I also knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. I climbed into the back of the SUV, the door closing with a solid thud behind me. The 2 officers, still in plain clothes, settled into the front seats without a word. The driver didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he seemed to be thinking, as if weighing something important. The silence stretched for a few moments. Then, the officer sitting next to me finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "General, what happened back there wasn't just a traffic stop. You were being targeted." I raised an eyebrow. "Targeted? By who?" The officer glanced over at his partner, then turned back to me. "We've been keeping an eye on a few individuals. Some of them may be in positions of power, and they've got their own agenda. This incident was orchestrated. That officer who detained you, he's not acting alone." My mind raced. I had been prepared for a lot of things today, but this was something else entirely. I looked out the window, the streets of the city flashing by in a blur, but my thoughts were still on what the officer had just said. "Why me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "What did I do to make me a target?" The second officer, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "It's not about you, General. It's about the position you hold. The power that comes with it. There are certain people in high places who think they can control outcomes, shift things in their favor. They thought you'd be an easy target to provoke. But they miscalculated." I leaned back in the seat, absorbing his words. This wasn't just some random traffic stop gone wrong. This was an orchestrated effort to undermine me, to test my reaction. And they'd been watching. Before I could respond, the vehicle slowed, pulling off onto a side street. The driver turned into an alleyway and parked under a dimly lit streetlight. "We're going to take you somewhere safe," the officer next to me said. "But we need you to keep quiet about this. If word gets out, there's a lot more at stake than just your reputation." I nodded, the weight of the situation settling over me. This wasn't just a matter of personal safety, it was bigger than that. I was a pawn in a larger game. And I was about to find out just how deep this conspiracy went. As the officers led me into a building nearby, I couldn't shake the feeling that justice was about to strike back, harder than anyone could have imagined. The building was nondescript, an office building tucked away from the usual bustle of the city. The officers led me through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. I could tell they were trying to keep a low profile, but there was a sharpness to their movements that told me they were ready for anything. They stopped at a door marked with a simple "Authorized Personnel Only" sign. The officer in front knocked once before entering. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with a large conference table in the center, surrounded by chairs. A few people were already seated at the table, some in suits, others in military uniforms. But it wasn't their appearance that caught my attention, it was the tension in the air. The officer who had been leading me spoke briefly with the people inside, exchanging low murmurs that I couldn't quite hear. Then, they all turned to face me. "General," one of the men, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, said as he stood up. "We've been watching the situation carefully, and it's worse than we thought." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the weight of the conspiracy that had been unfolding. The officer had mentioned being watched, but this was a whole new level. "We have reason to believe," the man continued, "that there are high-ranking individuals using their power to manipulate certain outcomes in the military and government. And it's not just about you. It's about what you stand for, what you represent." I straightened up, my mind immediately snapping into focus. "Who's behind this?" He paused before answering, his gaze flicking to the others at the table. "We don't have all the names yet, but we're closing in. What we do know is that this is part of a much larger scheme, an attempt to weaken our defenses, to control the narrative." I was starting to understand the gravity of what was happening. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why was I specifically targeted? What made me a threat? The man noticed my confusion and answered it before I had the chance to ask. "You're a symbol," he said, leaning forward. "A general with a reputation for integrity. Someone who stands firm against corruption. And that makes you a problem for those who want to control the system." I didn't know how to respond to that, but the reality of the situation was beginning to hit home. This was no random detainment. This was an attack on everything I had worked for, everything I believed in. "We can't do this alone," another officer chimed in. "We need your help, General. We need someone who's willing to take a stand, someone with the power to expose this. You're in a unique position to make a difference." The weight of their words sank in. I had always fought for what was right, but this was bigger than anything I had ever faced before. I stood up, my decision made. "I'm in. Let's bring them down." The room fell silent for a moment before the man who had been speaking nodded, a grim smile forming on his face. "We thought you might say that." The air in the room felt thicker now, charged with the energy of a plan coming together. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore, but I couldn't ignore the looming reality: this wasn't going to be easy. The higher the stakes, the greater the risks. The man at the table, one of the officers who had initially brought me here, leaned forward, pushing a folder toward me. The folder was thick, filled with documents, photographs, and intelligence reports. "We've been gathering intel on the people who orchestrated this," he said, his voice steady but full of urgency. "These aren't just local thugs. We're talking about well-placed individuals in the government, law enforcement, even private corporations. They have networks in place, people who do their bidding in the shadows. They tried to frame you as a threat, a person who couldn't be trusted, but we have the evidence." I flipped through the pages in the folder, my mind racing as I processed each piece of information. The names, the connections, the web of influence, it was staggering. Some of the individuals were familiar, others were ghosts, operating far under the radar. One name stood out. I stopped flipping for a moment, my finger tracing it as I read. This was someone I knew. Someone I had trusted. "Are you telling me?" My voice trailed off as I looked up. The man who had been speaking nodded grimly. Yes. This individual has been pulling strings behind the scenes. They were part of the operation to undermine you from the beginning. They used that officer to bait you into a confrontation. You were never meant to walk away from that traffic stop. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Betrayal. It was the one thing I wasn't prepared for. But I couldn't let emotions cloud my judgment. I had to stay focused. I flipped through more of the dossier, the information becoming more personal. Photos, messages, meetings. It was clear that I wasn't just a target. This was a full-on assault on the integrity of the military, and I was in the middle of it. How do we take them down? I asked, locking eyes with the officer. I needed a plan. A real plan. Not just the abstract notions of justice and truth. We've already started, he replied. We've infiltrated some of their networks. We've got insiders feeding us information. But we need someone like you to get close, to expose them in a way that they can't escape. It's going to take precision, timing, and trust. And we need to make sure they don't see you coming. I leaned back in my chair, my mind already running through possibilities. It was clear that this would require a level of strategy one hadn't anticipated. But if there was one thing I knew, it was that they had underestimated me. We do this by the book. We don't go rogue, and we don't make mistakes, I said, my voice hardening with resolve. I won't be a pawn in their game. Not now. Not ever. The officer nodded, his gaze hardening as well. Agreed. We'll use every tool at our disposal. But General, we'll need to move quickly. If we don't act soon, they'll bury this, and we'll never get another chance. The clock was ticking. I was in, and there was no turning back. The plan was set into motion within hours. The pieces were all coming together, but there was no denying that the stakes had grown. What had started as a seemingly random traffic stop was now a battle for something much bigger, a fight for truth, for justice, and for the very integrity of the systems I had once sworn to protect. We were in a small, windowless room, surrounded by monitors and equipment. The officers who had brought me here were now working seamlessly with a team of specialists, all experts in cyber intelligence, surveillance, and covert operations. Everything was being coordinated in real time. I studied the map laid out before me on the table. It was a blueprint of key locations, government buildings, private offices, corporate headquarters, all places where the individuals involved in this conspiracy might be hiding. Each of these places had been mapped out with precision, but there was something else marked on the map, a facility on the outskirts of town. It's the hub, one of the officers said, pointing to the facility. We believe this is where the real power is coming from, the mastermind behind all of this. This is where we'll hit them hardest. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. The betrayal I'd uncovered, someone I had trusted, someone I thought was on our side, had shaken me to my core. But I couldn't afford to let that distraction linger. This was bigger than any personal grudge. It was about protecting the very foundation of what we stood for. How do we get in? I asked, focused. The officer next to me slid a set of keys across the table, along with a set of security passes. We've already got clearance. You're going in as a high-ranking military official on a special assignment. We've forged the documents. Once you're inside, you'll be in a position to get to the heart of the operation. I studied the passes, weighing the implications. Once I entered that facility, there would be no turning back. No more small moves, no more playing by the rules. It would be all or nothing. And what about backup? I asked. The officer leaned in, his expression serious. Once you're in, there's no guarantee we'll be able to assist you immediately. This needs to look seamless, like you're just another part of the operation. We'll be monitoring everything, but the moment they realize we're onto them, it's game over. The pressure mounted. I had a role to play, but it was a dangerous one. The facility was heavily guarded, the security system tight. And yet, I had no choice but to trust the team I was working with, and to trust myself. "Let's do it," I said, standing up. "We move tonight." As we geared up for the operation, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on my shoulders. But I wasn't alone. I wasn't just a soldier anymore, I was a part of something much bigger than any single person could take on. This fight wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the future, about taking back control from the people who thought they could manipulate it all. The night was dark and quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the vehicles and the occasional distant bark of a dog. It was the perfect cover for what we were about to do. I was dressed in a tactical suit, blending in with the team, ready to infiltrate the facility. The adrenaline was building in my veins, but I kept my breathing steady, focusing on the task ahead. We pulled up to the outskirts of the facility, the large steel gates looming in front of us. It was a fortress, everything was high-tech, with cameras scanning the perimeter and armed guards patrolling at regular intervals. The operation was timed perfectly. If we were going to do this, it had to be now, or we would risk everything. I climbed out of the vehicle, joining the team. We moved swiftly and silently, each of us wearing a headset that kept us in constant communication. The air felt thick with tension, but the mission was clear. We had one goal: get inside, expose the conspiracy, and get out without drawing attention. We made our way to the side entrance, the one we had scouted earlier. A guard stood nearby, but he was distracted, focused on his handheld device. The officer who had been guiding me nodded at me, signaling that it was time. I approached the guard carefully, keeping my footsteps light. One swift motion, and he was subdued, lying unconscious against the wall. We couldn't afford to waste time, so we moved him into the shadows and proceeded. The key card worked on the first try, and the heavy door swung open with a low hiss. Inside, the facility was cold, sterile, and eerily quiet. The lights flickered above us as we moved deeper into the heart of the building. Each corridor was lined with locked doors, each one hiding something we needed to find. I was starting to feel the weight of the mission. Every sound, every shadow, made my nerves spike. We couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Straight ahead, one of the officers whispered through my earpiece. "The server room is on the left." I motioned to the team, and we made our way down the narrow hallway, careful not to alert anyone. At the end of the hall, the server room door stood before us, secured with a keypad. This was where we would find the evidence, the hard data that tied the conspiracy together. One of the tech specialists with us approached the door, quickly working to bypass the security. I kept my eyes on the hallway, watching for any signs of movement. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, with a soft beep, the door unlocked. We filed inside, and the technician immediately went to work on the computers. Screens flickered to life, displaying files, emails, and messages that linked the conspirators directly to the higher-ups we had been tracking. It was all there, proof of their manipulation, their control over everything from the military to the media. This was it. The moment we had been working toward. "Start copying everything," I ordered, my voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need it all." But just as the technician began transferring the files, a sudden alarm blared through the building, shattering the silence. The blaring alarm echoed through the building, sending a rush of adrenaline straight to my heart. The lights flashed red as we scrambled to gather the files from the server, the sound of distant footsteps growing louder with each passing second. "Move! Now!" I shouted, grabbing the data drive from the technician's hand and motioning for the team to retreat. The escape route was set, but with the alarm blaring and security tightening, it wouldn't be easy to get out undetected. We rushed down the hallway, the heavy pounding of boots behind us signaling that we had only moments before the guards closed in. The exit was just ahead, but we had to move fast. The facility was no longer just a secure building, it had become a trap. "Hold your positions," I ordered as we reached the exit door. I glanced back, watching as the shadows of armed guards grew closer. The facility had now fully gone into lockdown, and if we didn't leave now, we risked being caught. The door to the exit swung open, and I held it, motioning for the team to exit first. Just as I was about to follow, a voice rang out from behind me. "You're not going anywhere, General." I froze. Standing there, at the end of the hallway, was the man who had betrayed me, the person I had once trusted. His cold eyes locked onto mine, and his smug grin made my blood boil. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, taking a step forward. "Now, you're going to pay the price." I took a step back, ready for whatever came next. He was a high-ranking official, someone with power. But I knew something he didn't. I wasn't just a general anymore. I was a symbol of defiance. "You thought you could manipulate me," I said, my voice steady. "But you underestimated what happens when you push someone too far." Before he could make another move, I signaled to the team. They knew what to do. With precision, the officers flanked him, surrounding him without hesitation. The betrayal that had plagued me for so long had now been laid bare. He was the key player in a web of corruption, and now, it was time for him to face the consequences. "You're finished," I said, walking toward him as the officers moved in to arrest him. "This ends tonight." As the sound of sirens filled the air and law enforcement flooded the building, I realized that the fight was far from over. The conspiracy had been exposed, but it was just the beginning. There were still others out there, pulling strings from the shadows. But they knew now that I wouldn't stop until every last one of them was held accountable. We had won this battle, but the war for justice had only just begun.